Hello and welcome to the Political Update. I'm your host, Mark Lanigan, and today we'll be covering a range of political news. We'll first discuss the events out of Paris, then move more locally to some fast national news, and finally, we're joined with a special guest to discuss the Massachusetts state legislature after the new legislators take office. We've got a lot to get through today, so let's get right into it. We start in Paris on the Champs-Élysées, where for weeks protests regarding gas price hikes have been held in opposition to the policies of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Last weekend, these protests turned violent as activists turned to, as Parisian police claim, urban warfare and the worst riots in a generation. The rioters, initially just furious with recent environmental taxes that have increased the price of gas, have been slowly compounding and slowly becoming a group of a myriad of causes. The cost of living in France is rising, elitism in their government is prevalent, and Macron's approval rating has been steadily dropping since he took office. These angers were eventually released in burned cars, street attacks, and other acts of violence that were met with tear gas and police force on Saturday night. Recent reports put 133 people injured and 412 arrested. This is certainly a story that will have much more to come. Now we'll move to quick news from the U.S. national government. First, the Mueller investigation had a few new developments these past few weeks. Cohen pleaded guilty after lying about events that the president himself had confirmed the truth of, while Mueller is doubling back on Manafort's plea deal, which he claims he violated due to lying as well. On November 30th, 41st President George H.W. Bush passed away in his home in Texas. His funeral is planned for Wednesday, December 5th. The January 1st tariffs on China that were set to raise from 10% to 25%, and as some experts said, destroy the American economy, were recently struck down by a meeting of the presidents of the U.S. and China. Now we are joined by Representative Jeff Roy of the 10th Norfolk District, comprising most of Medway and Franklin. Representative Roy was elected in 2012 and was just re-elected again in the 2018 midterms, making his tenure a total of 4 terms in office. How are you today, Representative?
Great. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming on.
Sure.
What does the composition of the Massachusetts legislature look like for the next term?
Well, it's we'll be back to 160 members, have us at a full plate of representatives. There are going to be 25 new faces in the legislature this year, which is a fairly high turnover. I do recall one year before I got there, there was 40 new legislators out of 160. This year there'll be 25. The Democrats picked up an additional seat, so there'll be 136 Democrats in the House and 34 Republicans. I take that back, 33 Republicans and 1 independent in the House. So I'm looking forward to getting back there for a 4th term. It looks like a lot of things on the horizon.
Yeah, that's great. So of those things, what are some big discussions that you hope to see or you expect to see in the next term?
I would say a really big discussion will focus on healthcare reform. We made a major effort to reform the healthcare system last session. In fact, in June, the House of Representatives passed a comprehensive health reform piece of legislation. The Senate had done it a few months previously. We tried to reconcile those 2 bills. We were unsuccessful, and when the session ended on July 31st, we knew that one of the first things that we'd likely take up in the new session would be healthcare reform. I expect there to be some education reform measures, principally looking at the Foundation Budget Review Commission report that was issued a couple of years ago. We attempted to implement some of those recommendations. That's another piece that we couldn't reconcile between the House and the Senate, so I'm sure that'll come back. We're always looking at ways to look at the opioid epidemic and make some improvements there. I'm serving on the Harm Reduction Commission, which was formed in the opioid legislation that we passed this year. And the Harm Reduction Commission is slated to issue a report on February 1st of 2019. And we'll make a number of recommendations about ways that we can help stem the tide of opioid addiction and get folks more on the path of recovery. So we'll look at those recommendations. And I think we'll continue along our economic development front and the everyday business of the legislature. It's active, and sometimes those are events that I can predict. Sometimes things happen in life that confront us with new challenges, and so I'm always on the lookout for those.
So what are some of the things that you're excited to work on, of those or any others that you're really pushing for in the next 2 years?
Really pushing on the healthcare front. You know, Massachusetts has been a national leader in healthcare for the longest time. I mean, we were the first state to introduce universal healthcare. That was back in 2006, and we did some further reforms in 2012 and then 2015, and looking forward to doing some additional reforms in 2019, harnessing some of the technology that's out there. For example, telemedicine, you know, getting people to be able to see a doctor by picking up their cell phone or their iPad and connecting to a specialist without having to get in your car and drive into the city of Boston. I mean, that's particularly helpful to those people who live in the western part of the state. We want to look at reducing costs. We've attempted to rein in costs, and medical expense growth was in the 10 to 15% range 10 years ago. We've reined in spending, and was happy to see that this past year medical spending only grew by 1.6%, which is underneath the benchmarks that we had set for ourselves at 3.1%. So we're doing real well in that area. But unfortunately, a lot of people are not feeling the effects of that, and I hear from a lot of small business owners and individuals who feel that the costs to them in the form of premiums and copays and deductibles have shot up. So we're going to be looking at some consumer-friendly approaches to healthcare. It's all along the idea that we need to increase access to healthcare and get more opportunities available for people for treatment, but we have to keep our eye on the costs of healthcare and rein in some of that spending.
Well, that's great, and it's great to know what's going on in the coming years for the Massachusetts legislature.
Yes.
So thank you for coming in.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. And that's all for today. Thank you, of course, to our guest, Representative Jeff Roy, and thank you all for watching. Now we go back to the studio.